I mean, I'll just say, I told you at ARC, that I'm convinced. Well, actually, let me back up here. When I would teach bioethics, I taught bioethics at Trinity Grad School, a little bit. And usually I had their physicians in the class, practicing physicians who were taking this, just sort of to bone up on bioethics, or because, the hospital wanted them to study a little bioethics or something like that. And I could always tell, these guys and gals would come in hoping, like, please just give me the magical gotcha on a topic that I can tell my patient or the administrator, and they'll get off my back and everybody will be on the same page and life becomes easy for me. And day one, my speech to them was always, I've got bad news if that's what you're looking for. That doesn't exist. I can't do that for you, and here's why. And I talk about sort of 4 levels of conversation. So level 1 is the one where you're dealing in sound bites. It's not a child, it's not a choice, it's a child, right? Or my body, my choice, or things like that, right? These are just sloganeering sound bites. And then level 2, you get down to more long form conversations, which oftentimes long form conversations are dealing in just dialogue about applied ethics, right? So I'm already got my worldview. I've already got my moral intuitions or my ethical system or whatever. I'm not going to talk about any of that. I'm just going to talk about what I already believe, right? And then you're going to counter with, well, I don't believe that. And I'm going to say what I believe. And so you're not really talking about the underlying issues. Now, down below that, you hit meta ethics, where now there's actually a structure to what I mean by the words good and evil, right and wrong. Like I have some sort of understanding, not just of what those terms mean, but how we discern, what things are good and evil and so on. And then beneath that is usually the level of metaphysics, which is how you see the world in general, and man and God, if you believe in God, all that sort of stuff, which is what informs how you got to your meta ethic in the first place. And I said, the bad news is, in order to really truly have a meaningful discussion, you've kind of got to go all the way down to level 4 in order to really see where you two diverge. And I said, nobody does that. Well, not nobody, obviously. There are metaphysicians, right? Metaethicists, people like that. But the average person never does that. And so they live at levels 1 and 2. They watch the news and they hear sound bites that they agree with or disagree with. And then they have longer conversations where they're just sort of hurling at each other their applied ethics, and they never really get to the stuff underneath it. And I mean, just to use an example, one example was, I don't know, do I give his name? No, I won't. So it's not cause any embarrassment. I won't name who was in this clip, but I saw a clip that went viral on Instagram, and it was one of these gotcha moments, right? And it was this one conservative guy talking with this one sort of leftist girl, and the leftist girl is claiming that, I think in order to be a morally good person, right, you need to use another person's preferred pronouns. And the conservative guy was like, well, in that case, my pronouns are the guy who is right in this conversation, right? And everybody was like, oh, gotcha, right? And my reaction was like, okay, I get why that works on the internet, but if you really want to have a meaningful conversation, the response probably should have been, okay, well, you brought up morality and goodness, so maybe we should have a conversation about what you mean by the word good and bad person, what you mean by morality, how you discern those, what your underlying understanding, not just of those are, but how we discern those, what the structures of morality are, your epistemology of morality, and so on, so that we can actually figure out where we're really diverging. I'm a natural law ethicist. I'm guessing you're not. So, what are you and where do these come from? And the fact of the matter is, my guess is if that was the response, the gal would probably be a deer in the headlights, because she'd probably be like, well, I don't really know, right? Like so many people in the culture, she just functions on vague moral sentiments, right? And so she just sort of feels like that's probably true. And you actually deepen the conversation if you start to have a conversation about, well, maybe we should actually examine those words and examine how you got there. and how I got to the alternative place, that I am. And so that's really what I wanted to do well, spoiler alert, right, with my podcast. So I wanted to move more into this space of speaking directly into the culture, like people like yourself and others are doing, where you're entering the public square, you're having the public conversation direct to the people in terms of YouTube and Spotify and whatever else, right? Putting out the podcast, but really trying to engage these topics in a way that is sort of unique to how I navigate them, which is oftentimes a little different than the way other people do because I'm a metaphysician. So that's sort of like the broad issue is like, I actually thought about naming it Level 4 specifically because of that, but it's just going to be the Nathan Jacobs podcast. I mean, I know that's really creative. And when you think of me as a creative, as an artist, obviously you would expect something as far outside of the box as that as possible. But yeah. So the Nathan Jacobs podcast, that's really sort of the focus of it, is that I want to examine topics, everything from things like AI and can it make art, or whatever the public discourse is going on there, to things like what's the right direction for the toilet paper, and let me examine this as a metaphysician. you know So like, no, I mean, but there, it really is that sort of thing. And a big theme that runs through it is the theme that I mentioned to you at ARC, which is that I'm convinced that the most important issue in the history of ideas generally, and that is still the most important issue today because it sits underneath the massive cultural divides, is the question of realism, nominalism, which is exactly what you mentioned. All right. So for anybody who doesn't know, right, realism is basically the question of saying, I look out into the world, you look out in the world, every human being by default looks out into the world and we see structures, right? We think in terms of genus, of species, animal, human, common properties, bipedal, or, that ball is red and that ball is red, whatever it is. As well as these abstractions like numbers and, logical sets and things like that. And the question is, when the mind looks out and it does that, it can't stop doing that, it always does that. When it does that, does it do that because those structures are real and it's abstracting, pulling out of the world structures that are really there and identifying something that's real? If you say that, you're a realist, right? Or is it that the mind just needs to organize things, and so these are mental fictions that it projects on a world that really isn't organized, right? It really isn't that it's broken into these sort of genus and species and common properties. These are all just sort of mental fictions to impress order, to impose order on a world that really isn't that way in itself. And if you say that, that's nominalism, from the Latin nomen, for names. They're just a bunch of names. And what I'm convinced of is that virtually every hot button issue in our culture right now is a rift between people who are intuitively realists or people who are intuitively nominalists. And so, the most obvious contemporary example is the trans debate, where the first premise is, well, gender is a social construct. Well, that's a nominalist premise, right? That's no small premise. What you're saying is it's just a name, it's just a mental invention. We put it out there. And then for that reason, if we manipulate reality and then give it a new name, well, it is that thing because, it was never that thing in itself and it's in the first place. So, yes, we call that lump of cells a penis, but if then we chop it apart and we make it look like something else and we call it something else like a vagina, then all of a sudden, it is that other thing. And on the other side, there are people who are intuitively realists who are like, I don't think that's true. Like, I think it actually is a penis. And I think if you hack it apart and reshape it, it's just a hacked apart penis. It's still that thing in itself. Well, so right there, you have a realist and nominalist divide, but nobody knows that that's the divide that's happening. And yet it is. And that's why that's no small thing to expose that and say we should actually look at it from this perspective, because your first premise is a first principles premise, right? The first thing you have to do when exploring metaphysics and worldview is decide this fork in the road. And that's why I say it's the most important question of the history of ideas, because I'm convinced the best way to look at the history of ideas is just a history of exploring realism and a history of exploring nominalism. All the different topics are sort of subsets of that question. And so you see it there, but I think you also see it. It's been less obvious, but no less present in things like abortion, right? Whether it really is a human being that has all the rights and stuff, even if it doesn't look like it yet, or whether it becomes that at some point, we name it at that at some point. I think it's there in things like feminism and the question of, are the family structures and the hierarchies that, you know, society has tended toward because of differences between men and women, are those real? Are those social constructs that can be sort of disassembled and things like that? So anyway, I see it across the board in all these topics, and that's one of the reasons why, you know, a central theme within this podcast that I'm going to launch, and we'll see what it involves, you know, evolves into beyond that, but at least right now, just a podcast, is that theme, and trying to draw that to the surface, and in drawing it to the surface, offer a more sort of metaphysically refined and precise exploration of different questions.